Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Welcome back to our Dr. Class Tuesday seminar. I want to just begin by introducing my awesome co-host, Fran Hagopian. Fran, are you there?
Hi.
I also want to thank Paulo Ibarra, Jillian Scales, and Gabrielle Patterson, our crack team here at Dr. Class, who makes this and so many other events possible. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First of all, Spanish language translation is available for this event. So if you want to hear in Spanish, just go to the interpretation function at the bottom of the screen and you can hear translation. Secondly, we will be recording the event today, and the recording will be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after the session today. And third of all, we want to hear from you, but not too loudly and not through our chat function. So if you have a question for the panelists really at any point during the talk, send it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And you can feel free to submit your question to anybody, or at least anybody here today, and any point during the presentation. Just, again, the Q&A function at the bottom. Okay, arguably Latin American democracy is facing its greatest set of challenges since the 1980s. Democracy has collapsed into dictatorship in Venezuela and Nicaragua. It slid very quickly into competitive authoritarianism recently in El Salvador. It's being challenged to different degrees by elected leaders in Brazil and Mexico. Chilean democracy is facing a profound legitimacy crisis. In Peru earlier this year, supporters of Keiko Fujimori tried to pull a Trump and overturn the results of a presidential election. As all of you know, public discontent was soaring in most of Latin America even before the COVID-19 crisis. It led to massive protests in several countries, the election of anti-system populists in other countries, and those problems have only been exacerbated by the pandemic in the last 2 years. The news isn't all bad, given all how bad conditions have been across the region. One could argue that many of Latin America's democracies have been remarkably resilient. But we thought it was important to have a conversation about the state of democracy in Latin America, about its principal weaknesses, its strengths, and the challenges that regimes in the region are facing. And we are really, really fortunate to have four of the world's leading scholars of Latin American democracy with us today. I will introduce each of them up front, and then we'll ask them to speak for about 10 minutes. And that should leave us with about 30 minutes, 35 minutes for Q&A, during which Fran and I will take your questions. We'll filter out the raging conspiracy theories, and then we'll feed the questions to our distinguished panelists. And we should close by about 1:20 or 1:25. So it is a real honor to introduce our four panelists today. I've been a big fan of all four for many, many years. In alphabetical order, Fernando Limonji is a Brazilian political scientist who taught for many years at the University of Sao Paulo, the USP, and is now a professor in the Sao Paulo School of Economics at the Fundación Getúlio Vargas. Professor Limonji earned his PhD in political science at the University of Chicago, where he worked very closely with Adam Jaworski, with whom he published several very influential articles and a book on the relationship between economic development and growth and democracy. He's also published some very influential work on Brazilian institutions, particularly related to the functioning of presidentialism. Welcome, Fernando.
Thank you.
Second, we've got Beatriz Magaloni, who's professor of political science at Stanford University, where she founded and directs the Poverty, Violence, and Governance Lab. Professor Magaloni's first book, Voting for Autocracy, won several major awards, including Best Book Award from the Comparative Democratization section at the American Political Science Association, and it's widely considered one of the best books, if not the best book, on in either English or Spanish, on the stability and eventual demise of single-party rule in Mexico. Professor Magaloni is also author, along with Alberto Diaz-Calleros and Federico Esteves, of The Political Logic of Poverty Relief, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Magaloni's current work focuses on state repression, police human rights, and violence, with a particular focus on Brazil and Mexico. Beatriz, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Third, Scott Mainwaring is an old friend of ours, served as Jorge Paulo Lehman Professor for Brazil Studies and co-chair, faculty co-chair of the Brazil Studies program here at Harvard University from 2016 to 2019, at which point he was stolen away. He's now Eugene and Helen Conley Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. No comment. Professor Mainwaring is well known for his work on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and party systems in Latin American politics more generally. He's published several extremely influential books on Latin American politics, including Building Democratic Institutions with Tim Scully, Rethinking Party Systems in the Third Wave of Democratization, Analysis of the Brazilian Party System, and his book with Aníbal Pérez Viñán, Democracies and Dictatorship in Latin America, won a bunch of awards, including, again, the Best Book Prize of the Comparative Politics section of the American Political Science Association. A couple of years ago, the journal PS listed Scott as one of the 50 most cited political scientists in the world, and he is still growing strong. Scott, welcome back.
Thank you.
And finally, last but certainly not least, Maria Victoria Murillo holds a joint appointment with the Department of Political Science and the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. She's currently the director of the Institute for Latin American Studies, ILAS. Professor Murillo's research focuses on distributive politics, economic policy, and policy reform in Latin America. More recently, his work on electoral behavior, contentious politics, and institutional weakness. She's done work across Latin America, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Venezuela. And she's author of several outstanding books, including Labor Unions, Partisan Coalitions, and Market Reforms in Latin America, published with Cambridge University Press, Political Competition, Partisanship, and Policymaking in the Reform of Latin American Public Utilities, also published with Cambridge. She's co-author with Ernesto Calvo of a terrific book called Non-Policy Politics, Richer Voters, Poorer Voters, and the Diversification of Electoral Strategies, that came out a couple of years ago. And finally, she published two great books on institutional weakness in Latin America, along with Dan Brinks and some other guy's name I can't remember. Thank you to all four of you for joining us. We will go sort of in alphabetical order, but for technical reasons, we're going to begin with Scott Mainwaring. Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's, you should all be able to see. Go ahead, please. Please forward the PowerPoint. So my argument in brief, go ahead, please. Yeah, that is that the situation for democracy in the region is worse than it's been in decades. Go ahead, please. It's a brutally empiricist presentation. Those of you who were hoping for a theoretical exposition will have to wait for the other three. Go ahead, please. So this is what the data show in brief. I'm going to look mostly at the time span from 2000 to 2020. In this period of 20 years, there are 14 country cases in the region that show almost no change in VDEM's liberal democracy score. Go ahead. However, there are 5 cases of erosion in the region, including 4 clear breakdowns. Go ahead. And finally, there's only 1 case of democratic deepening in this period, and that's Peru. Again, that's because of the Fujimori dictatorship in 2000. Please go ahead. And so just a definitional note, I'm operationalizing stability as a change over 20 years of less than 0.10 on VDEM's liberal democracy scale, which ranges from 0, most authoritarian, to 1, most democratic. So 0.10 is a pretty small change. Go ahead. Let me begin with this slide, which shows the mean score, both using VDEM, which is the blue line, and the orange line is Freedom House. The scales aren't exactly commensurable, but they're both scaled from 0 to 1. And both of these show not a huge drop in the mean score for the 20 countries, but they both show some drop. Over time, this drop is not tiny. It's from about 0.49 on VDEM's scale to about 0.41 last year. Please go ahead. So, again, stability is the most common pattern. 14 of the 20 countries had a VDEM liberal democracy score that barely changed. Go ahead. These 20 countries include, go ahead, Ecuador, which showed first a significant erosion, but then a recovery. So the 2020 score is close to the 2000 score. Go ahead. And then Haiti, which had a coup in 2005 and a reversion to competitive authoritarianism until this year. Go ahead. So, I mean, 9 of these cases, we could say that stability isn't a bad thing, but 9 of these cases register huge democratic deficits. Please go ahead. This is, I would say, 2 clear authoritarian regimes, Haiti and Cuba, and 6 semi-democracies and a borderline case. Please go ahead. This shows, again, it shows these 9 countries, stability with huge democratic deficits. You can see in the final column that the change is tiny over 20 years. And you can see in the middle column that these are low scores that correctly register large democratic deficits. Go ahead. And so rounding out, the other 5 countries that show a high level of stability are the 3 high-level democracies. I agree with Steve clearly that, Chile is witnessing a process of clear questioning of the legitimacy of democracy. But nevertheless, through last year, VDEM's score showed, I think correctly, that it's a pretty high-level democracy. Go ahead. And then there are these final 2 countries that, that they're clearly more democratic than 9, but they're clearly not high-level democracies. Please go ahead. So this is the negative, the even more negative side, right? And again, I think that, we could quibble at the margins with VDEM, but I think that all of these cases are correctly coded, maybe not exactly the magnitude. So the 4 cases of, I think, unequivocal breakdown are Bolivia with the coup in 2019. We could argue whether it was a breakdown before that. Honduras with the coup in 2009 without a substantial democratic recovery, and clearly Nicaragua and Venezuela. And then the only case of these 5 with a major erosion that has not led to a breakdown is Brazil. But the erosion, according to VDEM, is very, very significant. Go ahead. And then, on top of these 5 cases, I think that El Salvador has clearly shown a very significant erosion this year with the capturing of courts. Go ahead. So not only is Brazil a case of erosion, it's obviously it's the biggest country in the whole region, and with a threat of clearly further erosion under Bolsonaro. Go ahead. This shows, there's a divergence here in how VDEM and Freedom House have coded this case, but this again just shows the very significant erosion that VDEM shows in the last 5 or 6 years. Go ahead. Freedom House shows Mexico as another case of erosion. Please go ahead. The orange scale again is Freedom House, and VDEM, if we use the 0.1 cut point as showing an erosion, VDEM comes pretty close to showing the second biggest country in the region as another case of democratic erosion over this time period. Go ahead. So again, the only case of democratic deepening, if we take 2 decades, is Peru. Please go ahead. And sadly, the entire improvement in Peru stems from the transition in 2001. Go ahead. So this is a dismal overview of what's happened with democracy in the region. Go ahead. 4 breakdowns. Go ahead. Erosion in the region's biggest country. Go ahead. An erosion in course. Go ahead. And the complete absence of democratic deepening since 2002. Go ahead. And I want to conclude by saying that I think the reality is even slightly worse than the dismal data indicate. Go ahead. So if Peru and Argentina are two of the most 5 democratic countries in the region, that's a really bad sign. That's not to diss these 2 countries, but they do have very meaningful democratic gaps. Go ahead. The biggest 2 countries are doing very poorly with a negative trajectory in terms of democracy. Go ahead. And I think that if we take seriously the idea that what happens in the neighborhood, in the region, in the Western Hemisphere is really important for democracy, here too, I think that the signs are more negative than positive. Go ahead. Clearly, democracy no longer has unassailable legitimacy in the West. We have cases, I think in Latin America, Bolsonaro is one of the cases of many. Go ahead. China's expansion, the dramatic economic expansion in Latin America, I think has led to weakened US leverage. Go ahead. And finally, on this slide of the beyond dismal of why we should be even more worried than the data indicate, transnational criminal organizations have expanded over the last decade. Their nefarious political influence has expanded. And I don't see any signs, maybe Beatriz will correct me, but I'm worried that this is a growing trend rather than a receding trend. Do I have time for one more slide, Steve?
Sure.
Okay, so my brutally empiricist presentation, I think it raises some interesting theoretical questions that I won't resolve, but I will raise. The first one is, what explains the beyond the 3 solid democracies in the region? It's not surprising that the very poor countries have not been able to deepen democracy, but what's, I think, distressing is that even the wealthier countries in the region haven't been able to deepen democracy. My question is why? Are these reasons idiosyncratic, country-specific, or are there common factors? And then finally, Brazil is the main case before the recent erosion of a very important democratic deepening after transition to democracy. I think the question I have here is, was its subsequent erosion over the last 5 or 6 years, was this a likely reversion to the mean? By the reversion to the mean, I mean the great difficulty in democratic deepening in Latin America, or was it more idiosyncratic / conjunctural? My own answer, I think, is more that it was not a reversion to the mean and that the democratic deepening could have been sustained. But I look forward to hearing what Fernando and others have to say about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. You're making us miss you even more. We now turn to Fernando Limonji. Fernando?
Hey, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I will go straight to the point. We don't have much time, right? So I will concentrate on Brazil. I will not talk much about Latin America as a whole. I don't have the data or the capacity to do that. And I start by saying that this is not an easy task to talk about Brazil and the situation Brazil is confronting. It's a very sad situation, a very sad situation. What else can I say? To put it shortly, this is a disaster, a completely disastrous government, a chaotic government, run by a president that doesn't know what to do with power, or it has only a negative agenda. For him, the way he was elected and his mission is to destroy everything, to return to the period before redemocratization. So everything that was built from democratization up to his election, he takes this as negative, as something to be destroyed. And this countered with a strong support from a liberal view or a neoliberal view that see the state as the problem in everything. But the Bolsonaro agenda is pretty much an anti-social agenda. What he wants to dismantle is all that I think Scott said that was a deepening of the Brazilian democracy, like the healthcare system, the improvement of the educational system, all these long-term changes that started after redemocratization, and that in which you see, or you can take it as having a line of continuation or sequence from Fernando Henrique to the PT government. PSDB and PT had the same agenda, very much on this aspect, that Brazil faced an enormous deficit in social policies. That was the catchword after redemocratization. Everything for the social, everything to pay the social debt that the Brazilian political system of the Brazilian elite has with the poor, with everything that was done in the past. So, and that agenda was put in motion. And you have a lot of demonstrations that this agenda was being implemented, and that there was a line of continuation between the PSDB and the PT governments. But for Bolsonaro, that was something to dismantle. More for him because of his idealization of the authoritarian regime, the military regime, but that got the imprint of a neoliberal agenda in the market side. So that was a reaction against what they see, or what he sees as a leftist government that had to return to the right. And there is no problem if you elect this someone with this agenda. This may be a legitimate agenda, something that it may happen. It may be for the good, I don't know, if the voters choose that. But the problem is that Bolsonaro doesn't want to assume the responsibility of governing. And that's very strange or very difficult to explain. But he doesn't see as his function or his mission, or as being elected the president, as having to exercise power. He's always complaining that he has to do things. And he passes all the responsibility forward. He's not the one to be blamed. Everything that happens is not the government business. And all that he does is to react against whatever go against his will or his capacity. And that was shown to the perfection, so to speak, during the COVID crisis. He didn't do a thing. He didn't make any effort to combat COVID. He refused to take vaccines or to import vaccines or support vaccination. And he's at ONU now, right, in New York, and he cannot enter restaurants and stuff like that because he is not vaccinated. So, and this in one moment was taken as a sign, as a positive sign that he didn't want to interfere with Congress, with Brazilian Congress, that he would refuse to follow the receipt that PSDB and PT followed, that is the so-called coalitional presidentialism. He refused to interfere in Congress and to have a majority organized. He said, my task is only to write bills, send bills to Congress, and then Congress does whatever it wants. This is his view of the separation of power system. And it got, it had support from some criticisms of the way the Brazilian political system used to work, in which all the negotiations to obtain support in the legislative were seen as negative, as negative bargains that would not lead to the government to work, blah, 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 blah. So, and this pattern of not taking responsibility for being the government is very well demonstrated looking at the data, legislative data. If you look at his participation as sending bills, having these bills approved by Congress, he has done nothing. And we can compare these first 2 years with previous governments and see how much he sent, the amount of bills he sent, and compare the proportion of them that were approved with the previous governments. And we see that he is not governing. But on the other hand, he is editing much more provisional measures, medidas provisórias, than any other government before him. He had edited the double of, on average, he had issued 2 times more medidas provisórias than any other government in these 2 first years. But he got only half of them approved. And medida provisória is like a decree that it works as a law, but only for a limited period. And you would imagine that someone that issues a medida provisória wanted to have it approved, right? If you say it's emergency, something urgent, the government has to act, because otherwise something very bad will happen. So it's like engaging your responsibility in this bill, in this medida provisória. But Bolsonaro sends the medida provisória and walks away, so to speak. It's not my business. And then most of them stayed in Congress for 60 days and then got rejected by the 120 days, because it's 60 plus a re-edition, and then the time elapses and go. So what I'm saying is the problem with Brazilian democracy now, today, is pretty much his president. It's pretty much his president. The fact that we elected this guy, and such a irresponsible and incapable guy, that everybody knew he was this kind of person. So, and he's kind of following the Trump blueprint. He's saying, before today, he's saying that the election will be stolen against him, that there is no safety in the Brazilian electoral justice, that the election will be rigged against him. So he's already announcing that today. So he will play the same game that Trump played. He will say, I won, they stole the election from me, and he will probably try something like Trump tried, with the same level of organization, with the same mess, with the same chaotic way of working. That is his way of working. He's incapable of organizing anything. So his school are like this, right? He really think he tried this last September 7th, a sort of a coup. But he's so incapable that he doesn't know how to make a coup. That's the bottom line. He thought that he would make a huge demonstration, and with this popular move in favor of him, everybody would say, oh, okay, so you are so popular, so you rule the country the way you want. That was his plan. So he's sort of this guy. So the real question is, how did we get there? Why did Brazil elect this guy? Why such an incompetent leader was elected? So my answer is a sequence of strategical mistakes by the political elite. What I'm trying to pinpoint is the problem are not the institutions. The problem were bad decisions made by the political elite after the re-election of Dilma Rousseff. It's a very complicated topic to explain in 15 minutes, so I'll just end with that. I think that the point is strategical. Politicians and the political elite and the economic elite made a series of mistakes. And they gave, so to speak, the election to Bolsonaro. He won by default. There were no leaders available, no political leaders available, because they were all killed before. Lula, or PT, made a resurrection in the end, survived a little bit, but it could not win. And the real question is why PSDB did that bad, why Alckmin had that non-support, why he were close to zero, and that's why, because the right killed him and preferred this crazy guy. So this is a bad decision. Okay, that are the sad news from Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. We now turn to Beatriz Magaloni. Beatriz, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Fran, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I will talk in general about Latin America and then try to bring some of the specifics to the Mexican case. I agree with Scott, and what has been said that democracy in Latin America is really suffering a serious deterioration in many countries. And I would argue that there are three main challenges that explain this deterioration. One has to do with populism, either left or right-wing populism. And here the question is whether populism would lead to the creation of an electoral authoritarian regime. And this, I think it's a very critical question, because in the case, for example, of Brazil, I agree completely with what Fernando said. This is a terrible government. And I would add that Bolsonaro has made also an alliance with the paramilitary groups that empower extremely violent mobs around the country that make the rights of minorities, Black people, indigenous peoples, and the LGBT community completely vulnerable. And that to me is really a very serious case of movement towards authoritarianism. But the question in Brazil is whether Bolsonaro would have the type of power that Chavez or Daniel Ortega had in Venezuela and in Nicaragua to completely change the institutions, pack the courts, and have referendums, get re-election forever until the system is no longer democratic. I do not think that Bolsonaro would have that power. He would try to claim elections are stolen from him, similarly to what we saw here with Trump. But despite the fact that the democracy suffered extreme deterioration, I don't think that is going to lead to an authoritarian regime, just because he doesn't have the type of power to mobilize the institutions in his favor. So I agree with what Scott said, that we do have clear cases of collapse, Bolivia being one of them, Nicaragua, as I mentioned, Venezuela, Honduras. But I don't think Brazil, and in this case, Mexico, would lead to that type of collapse. AMLO can be compared to Bolsonaro in many ways. He's left wing, so the discourse is very different, but in practice, he also tries to govern around institutions, and it's a mode of government that concentrates a lot of power in his hands. But the discourse of polarization, it's similar to what we observe with Bolsonaro. But again, I don't see that AMLO would have the power to change the constitution, to get reelected, and establish an electoral authoritarian regime. So in that sense, we are just talking about very 6 bad years in the case of Brazil. I think much worse than in Mexico. But I don't think this will lead to the deterioration of democracy to the point that we will establish an authoritarian regime. The second major challenge, and I think that is much harder to measure, is that in many countries around Latin America, the government is being captured by criminal organizations. And this we lack, I think, the methodologies to measure how much each government is being captured by these criminal groups. But I think this is one of the main challenges we observe in many countries, Mexico included. We observe that in Colombia with the paramilitaries and the FARC capturing local governments, financing local governments, and making this sort of a very perverse alliance with criminal organizations. In Mexico, I've been doing a lot of research in the states of Michoacán, in Oaxaca, in Monterrey, in Chiapas, and what you observe in these spaces, especially in the south of Mexico, in Michoacán, in Oaxaca, in Veracruz, is local governments that are completely captured by criminal organizations. And when that happens, there is no way that communities have rights to safety, rights to freedom, rights to anything. That's in part because of that reason. In many spaces around Mexico, self-defense groups have emerged. This is vigilante groups that actually try to establish order to repel criminal organizations that are associated with local governments and local police. And of course, this is when you're talking about warlordism, we're no longer talking about democracy. There might be change of power at the local level, but change of power that is heavily determined by which criminal group is in control. So criminal groups financing local governments or killing candidates when they disagree with them. That's the state of democracy, and I would call in many spaces in Mexico. And again, we don't have good ways to measure this because that level of corruption is very difficult to really unpack. So to really establish which government is captured, which government is criminal, underground people are really, knowledgeable of this, but we as academics have really very serious limitations in terms of how to measure that. So to me, this is a big challenge. As I mentioned, Brazil, I think that in addition to what Fernando mentioned, the association between Bolsonaro and the paramilitary groups, but also the empowerment to the police to just simply do whatever they want and kill without any accountability. So the total impunity with which the police deals with especially Black Brazilians in areas around the peripheries of the cities. This is extremely worrisome. I would say that if you think about human rights, and we have a way of measuring those, in my opinion, Mexico today is worse than when we had the PRI as an hegemonic regime. You observe more killings of journalists than we observed during the authoritarian time. We observe mass graves appearing around the country with complete impunity as to who is responsible for this. And basically, in these spaces that I'm talking about, and that I've been doing research, you cannot count on going to the police to denounce crimes, because when that happens, normally you get targeted by police itself that is associated with criminal groups. I've been working here in the US doing a lot of expert witness statements for courts to try to defend people who are asking for asylum. And generally the arguments that I observe is that when they go to the police tells them either I cannot protect you, or the police immediately targets the families. So that is a really, I think, very serious form of democratic deterioration, to the point that we can no longer talk about democracy, but we still observe changes of power at the electoral level. So we need to develop better methodologies to measure this, and it's very challenging. And the third point I want to make deals with justice and redistribution. I think a lot of the problem with populism and electoral authoritarianism really comes from the fact that populist leaders are empowered by disenfranchised voters that generally have been receiving very little from the system of redistribution. In the case of Chavez, it's very clear that's what brought him to power, a democracy that was very oligarchic in Venezuela, that had left the poor outside for years, and that empowered Chavez to come to power. Then he designed the Las Misiones Bolivarianas and created social policies that empower him to the point that he really had so much electoral support that he could undermine democracy. So interestingly, in the 1960s and 70s, this form of polarization brought military regimes. Now this form of polarization often brings populism. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that the region faces has to do with redistribution and justice. And this, unfortunately, I don't see that big advances. For example, in the case of Mexico, AMLO has paradoxically undermined the system of redistribution. He has created social policies, but these social policies don't appear to be working. Nora Lustig actually showed that Mexico has spent the least during the COVID epidemic, and actually has dismantled social policies, like including the cash transfers that used to, be quite effective. So without redistribution that actually benefits the poor, I think our democracies will continue to be very, very vulnerable. So that's where I will leave my comments.
Thanks, Beatriz. We now turn to Maria Victoria Murillo. Vicky, it's great to have you.
Thanks, Steve. So I think we have painted a pretty grim picture of the region. And what's interesting is I think the picture was already there before the pandemic. If you remember, the last LAPOP report in 2019 was pretty bad about the discontent, not just so much on democracy, but on the way democracy worked on the region. And I think this discontent, to put it in context, is similar to what happens in older democracies. I think the US came up in a lot of the conversation on Brazil. These are not transitional problems anymore, right? Really, these are problems that democracy has around the world. And democracy, as Scott mentioned, has lost its hegemonic status. It's not normatively necessarily the only regime in town. So I think we need to put in that context the problems that Latin America has. In 2019, before the pandemic, the rate of economic growth in the region was the lowest since World War II and the Great Depression. I mean, it was really, really bad. And that produced, as Beatriz mentioned, a reversal on the gains that had been happening in the 2000s in terms of reducing inequality, reducing poverty, improving social mobility. So the situation in 2019 was very bad economically, countries entering, fiscal crisis, and at the same time, very low legitimacy of the governments because of widespread corruption. Not that corruption didn't exist before, now it's more visible, I guess, thanks to democratization of the media, social and new technologies. So one of the things that we saw is that the pandemic only made these things worse. I mean, not only the region was very hardly hit in sanitary terms, but also had the worst economic performance of all the regions in the world in 2020. And that produced a dramatic increase in unemployment, in poverty, and in informality. And the hit, and I think this is important, was quite uneven. So it was much worse for those in the informal sector and for women than for the rest. So I think that, Latin America is a region full of inequalities, and many of them have been mentioned. This added one more to the picture. And I think that will produce a change. We haven't seen it yet on how Latin Americans see the state, because they demanded more of the state, but at the same time, because of the weak response of the state, they have lowered their expectations about the state. And I think we are going to start facing a polarized view, and opposed in the 90s, the Washington consensus, and there was this movement against state intervention. In the 2000s, a move in favor. I think we're seeing a more polarized view now, because Latin American states were not able to provide health facing the pandemic, were not able to provide schooling, which was crucial, because that was one of the big gains of the 2000s. And that had a traumatic effect on not just on kids that are going to have, as Nora Lustig showed, go back to the 1950s in terms of educational gains, but also on women. Labor participation by women in the region had declined like 2 decades. So again, this has a very, very dramatic impact in the region. And I think the other thing that happened, and often this was unintended, I don't think this was like an evil movement by politicians, but it was everybody copied the next guy, and they all forced quarantines. And forcing quarantines on the huge informal sector in Latin America meant that the poor, and not just the poor, the lower middle classes as well, those who had like a hairdressing shop or a little shop here and there, could not work. And this is a class of people that I remember when, in the good times of the 2000s, the World Bank was talking about the new middle class. This was called the vulnerable class, right? People who had no savings. And this hit, they received this crash, and they have no savings, and suddenly they cannot feed each other. So we saw during the pandemic, people in the neighborhoods in Bogota, like putting red flags, asking for food. I mean, the idea that they couldn't not go out to the streets was really dramatic. And it wasn't, they're living pretty alienated. So it's not that they are, having an easy time isolating themselves like we do when we need to do it, right? So, and the other thing that's interesting, and I think is going to have an effect going forward, is that the states really spend more money. I mean, with the exception of AMLO, of course. In general, most of the countries spend more money trying to, like in the global north, trying to deal with the pandemic. But that money, because of the weakness of the Latin American state, was more effective defending the formal sector workers and workers in the public sector. So that generates another kind of insider-outsider gap that is going to generate demands, and it's going to make the political system have to process these demands in ways that we do not know yet. I mean, I've seen surveys that ask for less state in Argentina, for more state in Chile. I think this is too early to see where we're going. But I think a change is going to happen in how Latin Americans connect with the state in the years to come. And that's important because, weak state capacity has been crucial in explaining some of the ways in which democracy is perceived as not working properly. The other thing that happened during the pandemic that I think it's more of a long-term trend as well in the region is that politicians were not particularly able, and here there are some exceptions, in showing empathy with their voters, with the population, in showing that they understand what they're going through. They're going through the things I mentioned. And many times politicians seem not to be attuned to those problems. Was that different from prior crises of representation? We had a wave, and Steve has written about it. We all have written about it. Remember the late 1990s, the early 2000s, the collapse of traditional parties and the emergence of new parties. As Steve has written, it's hard to keep a new party growing. I think the huge difference with that period is that there's not so good, like the organizations on the ground are less connected to party, or if they are connected to politics, as Beatriz described, is not a good way. So we do have social organizations. There's still indigenous movements. There's still the piqueteros. In Argentina, there's neighborhoods organizations. Everywhere, there are environmental groups, student groups, the evangelical churches that are really everywhere in the region, in the prisons where the poor are. And I think, very, very strong criminal networks and vigilante groups. I agree with Beatriz. I think they are providing, connections to people on the ground, on the bad, and sometimes even services. So, but all of these groups are not very well connected in an organic way, even the ones that we like, certainly not, you don't want the criminal ones, with political parties. So democracy has not learned to work without political parties. So far, we're still dealing with this 19th century institution, and it's very hard for political parties to be connected to society. Now that's something that Scott has written about. And especially at the moment, and I think Beatriz's point about distributed tensions here is crucial, where distributed tensions have become so traumatic because of the economic situation. And we knew in 2019, as Steve pointed out, those led to protest and led to anti-incumbent votes everywhere, especially. But what are the ways in which this is going to affect democracy if we look at not just separation of power and the VDM indicators, but the relationship between politicians or representatives and their voters, the citizens? To what extent the citizens believe the system represents them? And I think there's kind of two scenarios emerging. That one is electoral fragmentation. And I see those cases as cases where people do not seem to have good options. And I think Peru, although it's good in the VDM data, looks exactly like that. The most voted guy got 18% of the vote. That was more or less what the blank and null vote was. So really, nobody won the president. And yeah, of course, he was elected president because there is a second round, so institutions benefit him, but he doesn't have legitimacy, and he doesn't seem to be very competent either. So a minority president with governability issues. Chile, although it's so good in all of the VDM data, it doesn't look good on the ground. If you look at electoral participation, it has been incredibly low, to the point that the 50% that the Constitutional Convention election achieved was perceived as a huge gain, where in any other country it would be a disaster. And even on the Constitutional Convention, which is a good measure of the protest and the sincere votes of people, rather than a second round presidential election, what you see is a very fragmented system. The independents that won with this Lista del Pueblo, the Lista del Pueblo is already in disarray. Not only was it fragmented, but there was really no organization coming from the vote. There has been the first in-person survey in Chile for the presidential election that is coming up in November, so it's like 2 months from now. And it's again very fragmented. 40% are undecided or do not answer the survey, 25% for the left-wing candidate Boric, and 18% for Seychelles. So again, a very fragmented party system. I think, again, Ecuador is another case where voters are, they have a president, but they're not very happy with the president. First round was, again, very fragmented. And Lasso got there just because people hated Correa and were afraid of what was going to happen with the dollar. Important to measure in thinking about El Salvador in the future, whereas the Bitcoin and the dollar will be competing. Colombia, we don't know what will happen. The election is in 2022. There have not been primaries. But again, if you look at the recent surveys, you still see, the blank vote going up and even Petro, who's kind of the more popular leader on the ground, going down. The Uribismo is also down. It's really a much more fragmented case. So those are cases in which my reading of it is that the voters are not particularly happy with the supply they have of offers. On the other hand, we have the other set of cases, which I call polarizing cases. And you know, these might come from prior crises of representation, and voters see options. You know, there might not be ideal, I don't think they love them, but at least they have options for alternation in power. Bolivia is one of such cases. You know, the MAS won pretty strongly. Argentina is another case, and I think there are problems, I'm gonna come back to them. Uruguay is another case. I think Ecuador has ceased to be that case, maybe I'm wrong. In when you can't have alternation in power. And so are El Salvador and Mexico, you know, with all the problems that we have on Bukele and AMLO, people perceive they have an option. It might not be good. It might be that the concentration of power, in particular in the case of El Salvador, really damages democracy. I would venture to say, and Fernando, you probably disagree, that Brazil might still be here. You know, Lula is still the most popular politician in the next election. I mean, the reason Bolsonaro is claiming there's going to be fraud is because he thinks he's going to lose, right? So it's interesting that the polarization on the PT that allow Bolsonaro to win seems to have still be going on. I'm not saying these cases will not have the problems that Scott mentioned. I totally agree with that. But I think it's also important in thinking about democracy to try to understand what are the options perceived by voters, and to what extent they are able to signal to politicians that they want to be paid attention to. One of the things that democracy has done, I agree with Beatriz, human rights seems worse in Mexico now than when, you know, we met and the PRI was still in power. But one of the things that happen almost everywhere is that the citizenship has learned to stop naturalizing the many inequalities and indignities that it have dealt with. And so you have a much more mobilized citizenship, or one that turn off because it thinks the system doesn't work. But politicians have to really show that they pay attention to those demands. And I'm not sure the polarizing politicians will be able to do it, but that's what they're trying to do. Many times in a very incompetent way, as Fernando said, and I think the list of incompetence might be longer than Bolsonaro here. But I think there are tensions there. I think with Correa, we saw the tension that brought him to the election. In the cases of Bolivia and Argentina, you have presidents who are not the leader of the party, and that brings tensions. I don't think that's a solution at all. But I think it's very important that politicians should pay attention to what citizens see and want from democracy, for democracy to re-win legitimacy in their eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. So we've got about 25 minutes, and I'm hoping we can get through a couple of rounds of questions. I'm going to fire a few questions at the group, and you guys should just pick and choose the questions that are most relevant to you, and take, if you can, no more than 2 or 3 minutes in responding to them. Don't try to respond to them all, and then after that round, Fran will come in with a second round of questions. So to begin with, Francisco Morales sent a great question, which Vicky partially answered, but I want to give everyone an opportunity to weigh in on, which is how much of the current democratic crisis can or should we attribute to basically exogenous economic factors, the economic volatility caused by changing commodity prices and COVID. If the economic, how much better would the situation be politically if economies were relatively healthy? A second question was the extent to which authoritarian models are being diffused or being promoted, say from Cuba or Venezuela, via campaigns of misinformation and other things. Nobody really mentioned international fusion, but one of our participants was interested in that. A third question is directed specifically for Scott, and that is whether, Scott, you looked at other VDEM dimensions of democracy, like egalitarian democracy or participatory democracy, and whether the patterns are, I guess if you have looked at them, whether the patterns are similar or different. Another question, another dimension, the subnational level. One of our participants was Latin America has had a generation of decentralizing reforms, at least in many countries, and there's been quite a bit of research and discussion about subnational democracy in the last 10 or 15 years. And I guess the question is, if national level democracies are in crisis or stagnating across the region, what do we know about the state of subnational democracy? Are subnational democracies suffering? Are they helping to shore up democracy? Are they contributing to democratic deterioration? What do we know? Couple of other questions. Leonardo Vivas asks whether this is all a case of Huntington's revenge, whether this is simply a case of social change not being matched by institutional development. Vicky mentioned that democracy has brought a much higher level of citizen mobilization over the last generation. I agree with her. Is this simply a matter of institutions not being strong enough to match that societal mobilization? Two more questions real quickly. One I couldn't resist. This is not for me though, Vicky. I guess it's mostly for Vicky, which is how the hell is Argentina one of the most stable democracies in the region, given its prolonged economic difficulties? And finally, a question from me for Scott, although anybody can tackle it. And this is being a little contrarian regarding your dismal summary, Scott. In your great book with Anibal, you argue that the international geopolitical and ideological environment matters a lot in shaping regime outcomes. And so the 1980s and 1990s were associated with higher levels of democracy in the region, in part because you had a much, much more favorable international and regional environment. And I strongly agree with you. The environment in the last couple of decades, geopolitical, ideological, has been much less favorable. US has grown weaker. It's been much less consistently engaged in democracy promotion. The region is much more polarized. And I guess my question to you is, given that the regional environment is much less, considerably less favorable to democracy today than it was, say, in the 1990s, maybe 15 out of 20 cases remaining stable or slightly democratizing isn't so bad. Maybe this is actually a relatively resilient outcome, given the very, very difficult geopolitical, ideological, and obviously economic circumstances. So why don't we go in the same order that you presented? We can begin with Scott.
Great. Well, let me begin with the last question. I mean, I think that stability with fewer democratic deficits and fewer democratic erosions would be fine. So in 1999, I wrote an article for the Journal of Democracy whose title was "The Surprising Resilience of Democracy in Latin America." I don't feel that way anymore, though. I mean, I think that I do agree with you. The international environment has deteriorated, but to my mind, to repeat something that I said, you know, when Argentina and Peru are the fourth and fifth best democracies in the region with all of the democratic deficits that they have, that's disheartening. So, I mean, you know, and as I noted, you know, 9 of the cases of stability are cases, 2 of them are authoritarian regimes, and the other 7 have huge democratic deficits. I think when we're talking about Costa Rica, Uruguay, and I would say even Chile, you know, that their stability, to the degree that there is stability in Chile, it's fundamentally a good thing. I don't know how many of these other questions to pick, but the question about did I look at patterns of similarity using other VDEM dimensions, indices, The answer is no. And the reason is that, to my mind, what we typically think of as democracy, Dawlian democracy, or Linsian or Stepan or Levitsky, right? These are best measured by VDEM's Liberal Democracy Index. I might just add one quick thing about the question about subnational differences. I think we have really, I would say that VDEM and Freedom House both underestimate how important this question is. And to my mind, I agree with Beatriz, we do not have anything closely resembling good measures, but my intuitive sense is that the subnational level has led democratic erosion, that there's always been a huge gap across territory and class and gender in Latin America in the protection of rights, the actual enforcement of rights. But precisely because of the spread of criminal organizations and their capacity to dominate local and state governments, I think this is where where a lot of the democratic deterioration has been anticipated. And in Brazil, it's just hugely important, right? As Fernando and Beatriz both mentioned, you have important swaths, and in Mexico, this is true too, Central America, Colombia, important swaths of national territory that by no stretch, I mean, these are clearly authoritarian subnational regimes where militias and criminal organizations rule. I'll leave it there to so that our other great panelists can talk.
Thanks, Scott. Fernando?
Okay. Some brief comments. First, human rights was always a problem in Brazil. Police violence, here we are the champions of the world in this category. Here is terrible. I thought during the Bolsonaro government, it would get even worse, but I don't have data. But my fear was not confirmed. That doesn't mean that things are good. They are terrible. They have been terrible for quite a while. And so, but I don't think it deteriorated as it announced it in the campaign and in the decisions of the government. It could have been worse. The thing of militia is a real problem in Brazil, pretty much in Rio de Janeiro. And it's related paradoxically with the disciplinarization of the police. You expel the guy from the police because he committed a crime, then he's specialized in this, and he mounts a company. He starts a business. Ex-policeman starts a militia. And that's what happened in Rio de Janeiro, right? So several guys that were expelled from the police because of violence, they are specialized in that. They have an advantage in the market. They go and establish their firms, militias. And Bolsonaro is very well connected with them. That's for sure. But this is one. Second, regarding what Vicky said about Bolsonaro versus Lula, true. And that's why my problem is arriving to 22, having an election, right? And the system will be restabilization will come after Bolsonaro goes. And most probably, that might be wishful thinking. I think he will not run well in the election. He will deteriorate so that he will not make to the second round. So the so-called third road will be the second. So it's Lula against someone. And this someone will not be Lula, will not be Bolsonaro. But the question that I want to answer from the ones that Steve put is the one about diffusion. And I want to be very provocative in this. Yes, there has been diffusion, but not from Cuba, not from Venezuela. but from the US. Bolsonaro is a right-wing informed by the think tanks of the US. This is a real right-wing guy that has been being fed or feed, I don't know the word, but he's getting from this. And all his policies are all from these think tanks, and all these crazy things that he says, it all comes from the right wing in the US. So there's no Cuba, there's no Venezuela around here, there's US. And the example is Trump and the Republicans. That's the problem. And so this we were talking about deterioration of democracy in Latin America, and the question is, well, Steve wrote a book about the death of democracies, but not only in Latin America, but around the world. And this has to do with something else, not with Latin America, not that's something that is specific to Latin America, but something else that is going on. And it's funny because in Latin America, that came after some redistribution, right? While the OECD countries or all these countries during the 2000s were not having a distribution, but concentration of income, Latin America had a period of this redistribution. And so if we are facing the same problem, maybe the explanation is not in this, I don't know. But what I mean is, if there is diffusion, it's from the US.
Thanks, Fernando. Beatriz?
So I will take, three questions. One is in terms of exogenous factors, whether, what is happening is really attributed to exogenous factors like, for example, the pandemic. And so I think this is really long-term. So we've been struggling with these issues for at least, since democracies were established. And so I don't think there is really one single exogenous factor that is driving this, but obviously all of them matter. So for example, Trump, I think that he is in the case of Brazil, I agree completely with Fernando. Like it's an inspiration for Bolsonaro and other leaders around the world. We are not only talking Latin America here. So this should warn us, talking about consolidation of democracy. We would never have imagined this happening in the US. I mean, Steve wrote a wonderful book about that. And this is really a problem beyond Latin America. That would be sort of my answer, although obviously the pandemic has been very severe for Latin America, as it has been in many other countries around the world, influencing as well the sort of the weakening of the state, as Vicky mentioned, in its incapacity to respond really to the situation. Then I will talk about subnational democracy, whether this is really, in a way, a factor weakening or strengthening democracy. I think, interestingly, I said that my prediction is that, in a way, Brazil and Mexico are not going to go the Chavez way. And I think that in part is because of federalism. There is really a lot of checks and balances coming from, from the states that make it harder for presidents to concentrate power in a way that Chavez was able to do, and also, for example, Daniel Ortega. That doesn't mean that all democracies locally are good. On the contrary, if you go state by state in Mexico, you would find probably a couple of states where there is sufficient capacity to undermine criminal groups and establish professional police forces that are capable of providing order. I'm thinking, for example, about the state of Nuevo León and how the entrepreneurs there came together to establish police forces. They fire basically every police force in the municipalities around the metropolitan area, and little by little they build different corporations that are slowly professionalizing. I'm not saying the problem is solved, because this is a constant battle. But then you go to the state of Oaxaca, for example, where you find really basically absent capacities to establish order, and it's really given to communities to resolve their own problems of order. No? So there is a huge variation in the way that local governments perform in terms of democracy. But I think that a lot of innovations come at the local level. And in the end, if we're talking about what matters for citizens, it's really what is closest to them in terms of what provides local public goods, what provides security, what provides justice. And I think that's where a lot of our democracies are failing in the investment. And Vicky mentioned this very clearly. I think there is really sort of a weakness of the state in that realm. And I see in the question and answer, somebody mentioned the judiciary and the political control of the judiciary by the political powers. And I think this is one of the main problems that we observed, at least in the case of Mexico. There is basically a lot of control, political control of the Attorney General, where all the crimes start to get investigated. And so there is very little hope that you can really find justice if that is controlled politically. So in terms of whether subnational democracy is good or bad, I think that it goes both ways. And lastly, about Huntington revenge, I like that question about political order. I mean, many of you know I'm really now working. Most of my work is now dealing with that. And interestingly, I wrote a book about how excited I was about the establishment of democracy in Mexico in 2000, and then you see 2000 to the present, and sort of, yes, we have a democratic system in the sense that there is elections, alternation of political power in office, and so on, but human rights are really dismal. So in terms of order, I think this is really essential, and I'm not going to end with that pessimism only. I think that there's been creation of institutions in Mexico, very slow creation of institutions that matter. One of them being, for example, the Supreme Court and the independence of the Supreme Court. The other, the independence of the central bank. Two very important institutions that have been created in this in these 20 years or more of experience with democracy. So not everything is negative, I think. And I think these institutions are extremely important, because when politicians are able to control those institutions, and I'm also including here now the press, is where we start having this, switch to electoral authoritarianism, which is really what we see as the most common form of collapse of democracy today.
Thank you, Beatriz. Vicky?
Okay, so I'll try to be brief because I was told I have no time. So on the Argentina question, so I think the problems, the political survival of the Argentine democracy, it is related to its economic difficulties. I think that's more or less the argument we make with Ernesto in the book. The idea that politicians in Argentina are extremely responsive to voters, that allows, that makes them be very unstable in policy making. And that's certainly not very good for the economy. And whereas in Chile, the politicians were much less responsive to voters, and therefore they could sustain policies that allow for macroeconomic stability, but also build up into the unhappiness that we saw exploding in 2019. So following public opinion, it's part of the success, for good or for bad, of the Argentine democracy. And this brings me to how we define democracy. And it's clear in Scott's answer to the question that it is more about separation of powers. That's not necessarily how Latin Americans define democracy. I was teaching one day a class, and there was a movie about Chavez and the redistribution that Beatriz described. And so the person that was being interviewed said, "Oh, I'm so happy if democracy finally reached Venezuela." And then one of my students raised their hand and she said, no, this is not democracy. This is majority rule. And so I asked her, so what is democracy? And my student responds, separation of powers. So for Latin Americans, democracy is majority rule. And for Americans, maybe separation of powers, or at least for US academic environment. So I think that's important in trying to understand when the questions in the surveys are how happy you are with democracy, what people have in their mind when they answer those questions. And I think that brings me back to the issue of the exogenous effect, when there was a lot of, the Campello and Succo argument about there's a lot of money, it's easy to redistribute, people are happier. That might be good in the sense of connected with the people and majority rule. In fact, most governments were re-elected. It's not particularly good in terms of separation of powers because there were a lot of super majorities. So there might be a tension there within democracy that we need to deal with. And finally, on the Huntingtonian argument, and I think our book, Steve, with Dan, goes into this issue, right, of what is the ambition of the institutions that democracy has brought. So yes, we have institutions that are more ambitious than before. Many times they do more than they used to do before, but of course they do not deliver on what they promise, so they're weaker. So it's that mobilization, that representation of people who finally got the chance of taking advantage of democracy to ask for the expansion of rights that pushes institutional ambition, but at the same time, democracy can never deliver in the region at the level of what it promises. And I'm closing here.
Thanks, Vicky. 3 quick points. First, many thanks to Vicky Murillo, Beatriz Magaloni, Scott Mainwaring, Fernando Limonji for sharing your time and your wisdom. We really appreciate it. Secondly, just a quick point. You don't have to answer this, Fernando, but I agree with your point about diffusion from the United States and diffusion from Trump. But what I cannot understand about Bolsonaro and Trumpism is how the hell do you follow a failed model? Right? Trump failed to do the one thing that autocrats want to do, right? Hold on to power. He failed. Why is Bolsonaro following this this script? That's a puzzle I can't figure out. Unfortunately, we're not done to answer that question. I do want to thank everyone for joining us and tell you that next week, building on some of the things we talked about today, we have a great panel on the political consequences of Mexico's midterm elections of this summer and how that is shaping Mexican politics under AMLO going forward. So again, many thanks to our panelists, and we'll see you all next week.